Hi guys, sorry for the delay in getting this recorded and up. Those exams took me a lot of time to grade. Um, and so I apologize that we are just getting to this now. So we're going to talk about visual long-term memory. So there's a question of whether visual long-term memory and mental imagery are the same or different. So today we're going to explore that a little bit and figure out if um, when you're visualizing something and having mental imagery, is that exactly the same as when you're utilizing long-term memory for visual things? So where do our images come from? It's assumed that we have in our long-term memory stores of our different images and representations that we've come across throughout the span of our life that we found to be important enough to remember. So in our long-term memory, we've retained these representations, and in order to remember those representations, we pull them into our short-term memory and try to reactivate those memories and you know try to recall what they are. Um, so generally speaking, our long-term memory pulls images into our short-term memory, and it comes from there. So informing these long-term representations in our memory, there's the question of how this information is represented in our long-term memory. So we have two different options here, either that there's a representation of complete pictures, like picture nodes in our brain, or that there's representations of components of these images or image frames that can be filled in or completed as needed. So if it's the first one, representation of complete pictures, as an example of this, let's suppose that you wanted to form a mental image of Santa Claus. Since we're getting close to Christmas, you would have to activate the Santa picture nodes in your brain um, to imagine that image and bring it into your short-term memory from your long-term memory. Or you could do this right now with what your house looks like. You could activate the picture nodes in your brain for what your house looks like and pull that from your long-term memory. You could do this with anything that you have stored in your long-term memory of an image. Well, this seems to make some sense. A lot of evidence speaks against this idea. Instead, it seems that our images are more piecemeal and stored in components, more image frames, as the second option here is discussing on the slide. So therefore, if you want to form an image, you have to activate the specific nodes for that image, for the frame of that image, which will depict the form's shape. And then you can elaborate on that frame if you wish to create a full and detailed image. So it's more you're taking pieces of Santa and putting them together to form that image of Santa or your house or whatever the case may be. So we also know in support of this claim that images that contain more parts take longer to create, which is expected if images are formed on a piece-by-piece basis. And in addition, if there is more detail, it also takes longer to create in accordance with this hypothesis. We also know that people who are imagining these images can control how complete and detailed the images will be. So, you can imagine in your head right now just parts of a Santa. You can imagine just the outlining sketch of what a Santa would look like. And now if you want to imagine, you can fill in that Santa with all the colors and things like that would be a part of a Santa. I really wish I had picked a different example, um, but here we're stuck with Santa right now. Um, so you can make your images that you're imagining either sketchy or elaborate depending on what you're trying to do with that image. But when we're imagining something, how exactly do we do this? So basically, in our long-term memory, we store image files. Um, Image files are in our long-term memory, and each image file has the information that we need to create a mental image. So it has information about creating the frame, and then how to elaborate on the frame, and how to make it more detailed if we desire. It's almost like we have a recipe in our brain for the different image files that we want to remember. So our brain is basically putting the bits and pieces together like you would a recipe to instruct and construct that image. So this is kind of a like cardboard way of practicing this and showing it to you. But what I want everybody to do now as they're listening to this is you're going to imagine a white circle, a big white circle, and then you're going to imagine a medium-sized white circle that's on top of that white circle, and then a smaller white circle on top of that white circle. So once you have that image in your mind and you're recalling it, I want you to add the details that you might think would be a part of a snowman. Maybe your brain already jumped and said, "Hey, we're making a snowman," in our brain, because your tendency to imagine three circles on top of each other would automatically start drawing that recipe for creating the image of a snowman in your brain. And now you can make it as detailed as you want it to be. It could be just a sketch of a snowman with three concrete circles on top of each other, maybe a triangle for a nose and little black dots for eyes. Or you can go so far as to shape that snowman in your mind's eye and turn it into Frosty or Olaf or any of those images. And if you're playing along with me right now, you're probably seeing some of these things as I'm describing them. So the more you want to describe something, the more you want to construct something, your brain will pull those instructions forward and just create that image. It happens so automatically that we really don't even realize it's happening. But you know, I can make it a little bit more choppy by telling you how to put certain things together. So as I'm describing this, one of the things that you're doing is you are pulling the descriptive information I'm giving you, and you're working that together in your working memory with the long-term memory information as well. So another interesting fact about our visual our visual information here that's being represented in long-term memory. If you notice when you were trying to make that snowman that I was just describing, I wasn't giving you information in pictures. I wasn't putting pictures in front of you for you to recall the different details of a snowman. I was using sentences. I was using verbal instructions. So there's this thought that visual information is represented in a fashion that isn't itself visual. Instead, we kind of code it. Our recipe is coded possibly in more verbal information. Like there's verbal labels in our brain almost to imagine these different things. So just as you learned before, I believe in a past chapter, that if you have a better vocabulary for something like colors, you're more able to remember what colors look like. The same thing probably goes along with this visual information. So the more verbal abilities you have to describe something, a visual component probably gives you more abilities to imagine those different visual things. So you have to actually have the verbal labels there to create the image. So this brings us to a study by Carmichael that was done in 1932, which is a super long time ago, but I guess this is still a pretty influential study involving our long-term memory. In this study, participants were shown the figures that are in the middle columns of these images. So in the top, it's the two circles, and below that there is that kind of 7 or 4 looking item, and then the middle one and below is the sun. So they were shown those figures. And if the person was presented with the label eyeglasses, participants were later likely to reproduce the figure as shown on the left in that top image. If the figure was presented with the label barbell, they were likely to reproduce it as shown in the right, and so on. So this shows that when people are drawing different things that they're being requested to visually represent, that if we give them a particular verbal label, they're more likely to go in the direction of that verbal label than to go in the direction of something that they might want to create on their own from those zeros. So the middle one is that they were given either told 7 or 4, and you can see that they changed the image to represent those numbers. And at the bottom, you see that somebody might have been given the verbal label ship's wheel versus sun, and the images were developed from there. Another message emerges from tasks that require participants to reason about spatial positions. So in another study, participants were asked, what's farther north, Seattle or Montreal? What is farther west, Reno, Nevada, or San Diego, California? Many participants responded that Montreal is farther north and San Diego is farther west, but both of these responses are wrong. For example, Montreal is roughly the same latitude as Portland, Oregon, a city almost 200 miles north of Seattle. Um, so these errors seem to happen because participants seem to reason with this idea that, if you're in the United States, things in the United States are closer to us than things in Canada because Canada is a different country for us. So Canada is north of the United States. Therefore, Montreal must be farther north than Seattle. And Seattle would be closer to us than Montreal. So usually we're pretty sensible this way, and it will often bring us to the correct information, but sometimes errors happen. And it's the same thing for the other question involving Reno and San Diego. So you could also say, this is the example Dr. Starling gives, which is further north New York City or Barcelona. And you can guess from there if your mental map is correct. So if you want to, as a little test, just make a decision of what you think is farther north, New York City or Barcelona, and then you can go ahead and look on a map and see what actually is the case. So our ability to mentally represent maps and other things is influenced by our descriptive knowledge and reasoning. Sometimes this reasoning will lead to error, sometimes we'll do things correctly. So in these studies that I just discussed involving the maps, the biggest thing of interest is not the participants' knowledge about the latitude and latitude of the cities. What is important is the reasoning revealed hinges on propositional knowledge, not on our mental images or maps. So we have to have reasoning about other things more so than just our mental images. So spatial knowledge relies on our symbolic and propositional code. Sorry, that was a little rocky there. I lost my train of thought and it just kind of kept on going. So to talk a little bit more about memory for pictures, it's also been proposed that there might be two separate memory systems, one that has symbolic memories and the other that contains the images. That was by Pavio in 1971. But a lot of psychologists believe that this is not the case, and they think that there's just one long-term memory that holds both of these types of information. And within the single memory, each type of content has its own traits and its own patterns of functioning. So even with these two differences, the two types of information are contained in a unified memory, kind of like a giant library building with an index system that shows us exactly where we should find certain things, like where the books are, where the photographs are, and so on. Visual memory, we do know, is heavily influenced by our schema-based generic knowledge, knowledge about how events unfold in general. So you can see, and back in chapter 8, you guys talked about how our knowledge affects our memory for sentences and stories. This is also similar for pictures. So in one study in 1979, Friedman showed participants pictures of scenes like a kitchen or a barnyard. In addition, these pictures contained something unexpected. So as far as the kitchen was concerned, there was something rarely found in a kitchen, like a fireplace or a toilet or something like that. Participants were later given a recognition test in which they had to discriminate between pictures they'd actually seen and altered versions of these pictures in which something had been changed. Participants' memories were influenced by their broader knowledge of what should be included in the kitchen picture. So in some of the test pictures, one of the ordinary expected objects had been changed. So, for example, participants were shown a test picture in which a different kind of stove appeared in place of the original stove, or one in which a radio replaced a toaster on the counter. Participants rarely noticed these changes that seemed to be things that could actually occur, and they often responded to a new picture as it being old. So even if there was a change, like the stove was different or something like that, they said it was an old picture. They had already seen it because it was an expected change. However, if there were changes that were unexpected, so, if the stove was replaced by something like a toilet, or if, in the originally viewed kitchen, there was a fireplace and the test picture did not have a fireplace, participants consistently detected this alteration. So if there was something that didn't fit in the kitchen picture, previously and then they were shown a new picture and it was gone, they would identify that this was a new picture. Another example could be with a barnyard or a farmyard. They're shown a picture with a dog, which is expected. Um, and so then if they're shown a farmyard with a cat later on, they wouldn't say that that picture was necessarily new when they were trying to recall. However, if they were shown a farmyard picture with a rocking horse the first time and then it was maybe a regular horse in the new picture, that would be considered unexpected and they would identify that recognition. So this is just continuing on a little bit more with that study. So recognition tests change some of the objects. If they changed an expected object, it was harder to detect. Changing an unexpected object was easier to detect. One of the other things that was noted in this study was that when Friedman was collecting data, she recorded participants' eye movements during the original presentations of the pictures. Data showed that participants tended to look twice as long at the unexpected objects as they did the expected ones. So clearly these objects did catch the participants' attention, and it seemed like they were encoding them into memory more than when there were expected objects in the pictures. We also tend to import our own expectations into images or things as we're trying to recall them or discuss them. There's a pattern that's demonstrated in picture memory called boundary extension. And this is that people remember a picture as including more than it actually did, basically meaning that they extend the boundaries of the remembered depiction. So another study, participants were shown the top panel in this picture, the top part of this picture, of a photograph of these trash cans in front of a fence. And the two panels below show the scene as drawn from memory by two different participants. The participants clearly recalled the scene as a wide angle shot, revealing more of the background than it actually did. So when they drew it from memory, they recalled the fence to the side. They recalled the top of the fence, which wasn't actually in the image they were shown. And in general, they included a lot more visual information than they were actually given. This effect is observed whether they were shown the pictures and then tested immediately, or if they were shown the pictures and then tested when there's a delay. Even if they're warned about boundary extension, it still occurred. Sorry, I paused for a minute there. My phone started to ring and I needed to check who it was. So the people who did these studies argue that boundary extension arises from the way in which people perceive these pictures in the first place. We understand pictures by means of a perceptual schema, according to Intraub, who was one of the people that completed this study. The schema puts our picture into a larger context. So because we have this mental representation, generally speaking, we tend to, in our mind, put these things in a larger context than we actually see when we're provided with an image or we're recalling something. So generally, we have expectations about what we would see if we were looking at a scene. Just to give a little bit more information about it's the experience that is remembered. So it's not just the picture that's remembered, but also the experience that goes along with it. So your image includes both the picture and your understanding of what you'd see if you explored further. And this is what leads to this boundary extension that's shown when we do studies about pictures like the one here in this slide. So based on all of these different studies, it looks like our visual long-term memory is very similar to our verbal long-term memory. We have descriptive verbal representations that are influenced by prior knowledge and schema. And in the same way that we remember things verbally, we remember things visually based on these representations and prior knowledge. So this brings us back, though, to the question of whether visual and verbal long-term memory are separate systems or are they one and the same. As I mentioned before, Pavio in 1971 stated that there were two different memory stores, or they're two different parts of the same big system. So another theory of our long-term memory is that we have dual coding available to us. Essentially, this means that we have two different memory stores. We either have a verbal store or an image store, and either record is going to provide the information we need, which gives us a double chance of locating the information and easing the process of memory search. So Alan Paveo's theory, dual coding, states that there are two types of long-term memory. There's symbolic memory, which is based upon our verbal search, our propositions, and then there's image-based memory. So some of Paveo's studies provide evidence for dual coding. In one study, a group of participants was asked to rate nouns on how readily they evoked an image. So they were given different lists of nouns and asked for a scale of 1 to 7 for how readily it gave an image. For example, some of the words were things like church or elephant, or maybe things like dog. Um, and other words were things like virtue and context. Certain words were considered and rated as higher imagery, like for example, elephant and church, and other words were rated as low imagery, such as virtue and context. Um, as a second step, uh, there was a new group of participants that were asked to memorize the list of words, and it showed that participants were more able to remember high imagery words than low imagery words. So in the one group, they were asked to rate the words as high imagery or low imagery, and then the other group was given the same nouns, and they showed they showed that the high imagery words were remembered better. So with that being said, I want you guys to think about on your own how this supports dual coding, with the thought that there are separate memory systems for verbal images or verbal information and a separate system for visual information. Another study looked at mnemonics that people use to try to remember different words and images. And in this study, also by Paveo, participants learned pairs of words. They were asked to silently rehearse them, or make up a sentence, or form an image where the words interact. So those were the three different groups. So the silent rehearsal group was just asked to take the words and rehearse them and try to remember them. The second group was asked to make up a sentence using the two words from the pair. And the third was asked to form an image for the pair where the words interact. So for example, if we gave you the pairing of a book and a horse, and you rehearse that versus made up a sentence or versus formed an image, who would remember the best? And there's another word pair for bacon, car, and ring. And what this study showed was that those people who were asked to form an image for the pair where the words interacted were much more likely to remember the words than those who were asked to rehearse or make up a sentence. The rehearsal group was the worst. They were the least able to remember the word pairs. In second was those who were asked to make up a sentence. They were better than those who were just asked to rehearse the words. But overall, the group that was asked to form an image for the pair where the words interact did the best overall. So, for example, you can see these images of a horse jumping over a book, and turning interaction of bacon car and a ring by making it a pig car with a ring around it to remember the words. Someone who was able to do that and form an image would be more likely to remember than the other two groups. So while those data could account for there being those two separate systems, as Paveo stated, they could also show that we just use a single system. There's really nothing proving anything with those two studies, even though Paveo would state that it shows that there's dual system. So here's the support for there being a single system. As I stated earlier before, there's an idea that within our single long-term memory, verbal and visual content probably has its own traits and its own way it functions, but there's most likely just this unified memory. And one of the things that shows this is that we are able to, when we're recalling memory, we can use the same different kinds of connections. So you can use priming to remember both verbal and visual things. Encoding specificity is observed in both domains. and things like primacy and recency effects are shown in both domains. So the fact that we use the same um, memory connections can really show that it's probably coming from the same memory area, long-term memory. Along with this, as we've been discussing throughout this lecture, there's also a lot of schema-based knowledge that is used to recall visual things, and this is the same for verbal things. So we use our past experience and our understanding of different areas of knowledge to generate verbal things the same way we use it to generate visual. So since there is just one long-term memory system for both verbal and visual memory, with this set of rules that is consistently applicable to the contents of that memory, whether it be verbal or visual, what does that mean for other memories, like memory of smell or emotion or touch or our hearing or audition? Are they part of the same system, or do they all have their own memory store? Um, Unfortunately, there's not a lot of research that looks at these different things right now to see if everything's part of the same system. However, my thought is that if we had different systems for every type of memory, that would become a lengthy process for our brain to be able to process all of those different types of sensations. So I would imagine that because we have the same system for verbal and visual, or so we think, that that would go along with the other areas as well. So this wraps up this section on visual knowledge. So we had the visual imagery slides and now the visual memory slides. So just as a little summary of all of this material, mental images and working memory act like they're being manipulated visually rather than verbally. We know that imagery and perception rely on the same systems, and that our spatial and visual imagery are distinct but often act together. We know that mental images are not the same as pictures, they're more like recreations of our perception, utilizing our experience. We also know that visual long-term memory does not necessarily use the same kinds of representations, that it stores the knowledge needed to create mental images, and it's stored in a way similar to other information we've talked about in long-term memory, involving things like our verbal memory. Although there is that dual coding theory, but for the most part, a lot of the more recent studies and information from other theorists suggest that this is not the case, and that we do store everything in long-term memory, and there isn't a separate system as Pavio suggested. So that's it for the visual knowledge section of the slides. Um, Please let me know if you have any questions, and hopefully I will be posting the next set of slides shortly.